This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Okay, welcome back to Heard Tell. He is the most visited guest in the history of the Heard Tell program because he's just that much fun. He's just that smart. He's even handsome with his new haircut and his wonderful background to the Burt Reynolds Nebula. Our good friend, Dr. Michael Siegel. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, my friend?
Unfortunately, we got a little bit of a dark topic for you today, but because we respect you so much, we think this is the perfect person to talk about it. I feel about this topic kind of like I do cancer. It's like, okay, is there really more cancers, or are we just learning more about it and we see more about it and it's louder? What do you think it is when we deal with something like anti-Semitism? Because we know human nature doesn't change. We know, prejudices and bigotries and things like that don't really change. Is there more of it, or is it just louder, faster, stronger, and the really bad people can congregate more easily nowadays?
I think it's the latter. I think there's less anti-Semitism than there used to be. Certainly from when I grew up and in the 1980s, when I was a kid, wasn't exposed to a lot of anti-Semitism, but there was an incident where a cross was burned on the lawn of our synagogue while it was under construction. And I did know friends who experienced violence, actually, because of anti-Semitism. So I think that sort of thing is reduced. But I think in the age of the internet, any kind of extreme voice tends to get amplified. You had, for example, there was this debate in 2016 over the deplorables around Donald Trump. And I think that was a very tiny fraction of his support. But with the internet, that tiny fraction can amplify up so much so that they become very, very loud. And especially, I think, the media has a tendency to give a lot of attention to these people, not unjustifiably so. When you hear someone espousing violence and discriminatory views, you definitely don't want to ignore that and let it fester. But I do think that things have gotten better generally in that. I'm just, and especially comparing to when my father grew up and things like that, when they had, major schools had quotas on how many Jews they could admit, where, he knew doctors who were fired because they were Jewish, on kind of slim pretexts. He knew people in the military who were not promoted because they were Jewish. I mean, it wasn't said openly, but it was pretty obvious what was happening. That sort of thing has disappeared, or at least significantly reduced. But I do think when you're talking about extreme groups that are way out there, that especially with the internet, that has to have a tendency to amplify their voices and give them a very loud reach.
Let's back up for a second, because I know we hear things in history, but we don't put personal faces to it. You're talking about growing up in the 80s. I've talked about, when I was growing up in the 80s, even though you're a little bit older than I am, we talk about that World War II generation. Like if you saw an older man, you just assumed he was a World War II vet, right? Mm-hmm. You grew up in a Jewish community. You still had that Holocaust generation. There was lots of those folks. They're almost all gone now. Yeah. Is there a generational difference now besides the technology and that stuff? That's just a huge generational difference, because that working knowledge, unfortunately, that word of mouth tradition, that's almost gone now. Has that changed it too? And has that changed how the community views some of this stuff, do you think?
That's a very good question. And I don't know that I have a very good answer to it. During the 1970s and 1980s were kind of an era where the awareness of the Holocaust in particular came into flower. But before then, a lot of Holocaust survivors would talk about how they were kind of discouraged about talking about it. I talked to a Holocaust survivor who came to this country and tried to tell his family what had happened, and they didn't want to hear about it. because it was so horrible. And there was a time when people wouldn't talk about these things, and then that started changing. And I think thankfully, a lot of these people are dying off, but we also have the Shoah Project, which has preserved a lot of their firsthand testimony. We have a lot of great documentaries. The Shoah documentary is very long and very arduous, but I think it's very good for interviewing people on all sides, not just the people who were the victims, but the perpetrators and the bystanders and so forth. I think in the digital age, that has allowed a lot of these voices to be kept alive long after the survivors are going, so that if you seek it out, if you want it, you can find that information. I mean, there has been a tendency to sort of try to bury these things in the past. Just to give another personal example, in the 1910s, a businessman named Leo Frank was accused of murdering one of his workers, a young teenage girl, and was very likely innocent, and was convicted and eventually lynched by a mob. My grandparents grew up during that. They were teenagers. They would not talk about it until the 1980s. Then people started talking about it, and there were movies about it, and suddenly they were reluctant, but people would talk about it then. So the willingness to talk about these things kind of waxes and wanes. But I think as we are losing that firsthand testimony, but with the digital age, and especially the Shoah Project, that has allowed a lot of that firsthand testimony to be preserved.
You said something really important, Dr. Michael Siegel, joining us, our very good friend here on Heard Tell. I think you said something really important about that project, that yes, they interviewed the survivors and they interviewed some of the perpetrators. One of the really important groups that we don't talk about, and it's not just anti-Semitism, it's race-based hatred, religious-based hatred, class, whatever kind of hatred you want to talk about, the bystanders. Because that's the group that does the enabling. That's the group that usually controls the power structure that the hatred operates out of. Anytime you have hatred and abuse that comes from hatred, there's that big swath of bystanders. And I think, this is my opinion, you tell me what you think. I think what we're seeing digitally is, I think it's better in the real world, but digitally, I think you're getting some real hard dividing lines between that extreme element. But I think the people that are bystander-ish or bystander-ish tendencies are really exposing themselves online in this day and age. Is that fair to say it that way?
I think so. You can look at history and see that the kind of horrors we talk about with the Holocaust, or even just separating from the Holocaust to other incidents in history with other groups that have been oppressed or been the subject of mass murders, the vast majority of people just sort of want to go along. They might be against it, but they don't want to do anything about it, and they just want to get through their day and so forth. And what that does is enables those tiny minorities of really bad people. That gives them the freedom to act. And so I think, not just when we're talking about anti-Semitism, when we're talking about any sort of ism, there is a responsibility of people to speak out and say, no, this is not acceptable, and to oppose when they can. Because the vast, one of the things I've said on my YouTube channel is the vast majority of people are good, but we are very easily tempted when there's something at stake like money or honor to do the bad thing. We're very good at rationalizing, not acting when we see something that's wrong, and that's a difficult tendency to overcome, but one that we sort of have to. And especially in this digital age, when extreme voices, even if you're talking about only 1%, can be amplified up so dramatically and can have such dramatic power, way out of proportion to their numbers. I think there is a responsibility of people to not stand by.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joined us. I find it interesting. Like, I've seen it in my own children. I have teenagers through young adults now as children, especially the two younger teens. They just have zero tolerance for stuff like this because they've been, they're very, very online. They've been, they've moved around the world a little bit. I hope that I've tried to teach them a little bit along with their mother, but mostly it's just them. They have such a basis of knowledge because of the technology. They're exposed to a wide swath of culture that, previous generations weren't. They have zero tolerance for this stuff. Like, as soon as they hear something, they're like, oh no, that's racist, or that's anti-Semitic, or that's class. Like, they just zero tolerance for it. Inside of the community, though, because you're raising your own children now, what is it like now in the digital age? Because it is different. Maybe it's more online than just somebody making a comment on the street like it used to be then. How does that change in the online communities inside of the Jewish community, especially like you're raising your own kids? Because now you've got this whole digital sphere that's a whole different ballgame, isn't it?
Yeah, and it'd be difficult for me to speak for the entire Jewish community because everyone's experience is different. I would say that talking to people, it seems like there's less fear of the kind of institutional discrimination and so forth that used to be faced and used to be more common, where you had, clubs that would exclude Jews and colleges that would have quotas on Jews and that sort of thing, and more fear of, what happened in Pittsburgh, where a lone guy, with, hatred amplified by internet voices went into the synagogue and massacred a bunch of people. There's more fear, I would say, of the power of a single person to do horror than there is of institutional horror at this point. But again, that might not be the perception of other people, so I'd be hesitant to speak for everyone. But like you, I've seen with my daughter the same thing. She's, 15. She also has very little tolerance for that sort of thing, and her school has sort of that tolerance. There was a thing at one of the schools where some kid wore had a Nazi symbol, and this caused a lot of controversy because the vast majority of students were like, "This is not cool. This is not funny. This is not ironic. You need to get rid of that."
Michael Siegel joining us again. That's Dr. Michael Siegel to you folks. If we're talking science, when we're just talking on ordinary times, we just call him Hal because of his Twitter handle that you see there. You mentioned Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, we know what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue. We've had other instances of it. Thankfully, the recent headlines have been thwarted attacks, but there are people out there that keep targeting Jews and Jewish communities and synagogues. I lived in Germany twice. Synagogues on high holy days and on, for normal weekly service, they have armed polizei out front. They just do. That's just reality over there. The house, I'm a Baptist. The house of worship I worship at, in fact, the last two churches I've attended, they both have armed security during service, or I won't attend there. That's something I'm just cognizant of. Do y'all think about it? You mentioned it. How readily is it in people's mind when they're just going to a normal service or Shabbat or whatever the case may be, a high holiday maybe especially? Is it on people's minds because it's got to be part of the thought process after things like Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly with the rash of mass shootings we've had recently, that sort of thing has been on people's minds. I mean, and just, when we had the mass shooting in Texas, there were teachers outside the schools, there were police outside the schools. Right after the Tree of Life shooting, there were, that was in our state. So there were armed guards outside of our synagogue. It's not something that I would say is distracting. It's just something that you sort of have to do, that unfortunately you have to think about. But again, that would plug into what I was saying earlier about how the fear is less of institutional stuff and more of a rogue agent. And it's not surprising that this has popped up with some of these crazy conspiracy theories going on because, eventually they will circle around to anti-Semitism. It's very easy. We're a very small minority. You're not talking about maybe 2% of the American population. And there are very easy tropes to fall back on with, Jews control the banks and all that sort of thing. So it's a very lazy hatred to fall back on for a lot of these extremists. So it's not surprising, but it's just something that you have to sort of deal with.
Yeah, unfortunately. Michael Siegel joining us. All right, that's the history and the cultural side of it. Unfortunately, we've got some real world examples, and it's not just internet people. It's people seeking office and two people that are actually heads of states of powerful countries. We're going to go through that. Michael Siegel joining us once again on Heard Tell. We'll continue right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Dr. Michael Siegel, one of our favorites because he's on this program more than any other guest. Long may it continue, my friend, because you give good content, sir, among all your other great accomplishments in life. Joining us, he's a scientist, but we're talking a little more culture stuff today. Okay, we're talking anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, I wish this was all just a philosophical exercise, but it is not, because we have real-world people, one seeking power, two people that are heads of states that have issues in this regard. Let's start right in your backyard, Pennsylvania. Doug Mastriano is running for office there. He wants to be governor. He has gotten himself in some trouble with a financial backer from the guy that started up Gab. And I don't want to rehash this because we already talked about Gab before. Gab is a cesspool. It was purposely built to circumnavigate certain rules. So, and I'm not saying everybody on there does this, but this is what it was designed to do. It's so you can say stuff there that you can't say in regular polite society, including a lot of racist and anti-Semitic things. There's financial ties there. The founder, Andrew Torba, came out and made comments. I don't want to take this out of context, so I will quote him. He basically came out and said, well, we don't give interviews to any reporters that aren't Christians, meaning Jewish reporters. He said he was getting consulting fees. Yesterday, Mastriano came out and denied all this, said, no, he doesn't have anything to do with my campaign. I don't tolerate anti-Semitism. That's a lot to unpack, but this is not a new story. If you're taking money from somebody and they have bad ties, you can parse that part out in. How does this land for you? Because this is an election you have to vote in, and that will affect you because you live in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I can't look into Mastriano's heart, so I don't know if he is anti-Semitic or not. I'd never heard anything particularly about that before this scandal erupted, so I have a tendency to give people a benefit of doubt, which maybe I shouldn't, but I hesitate to accuse someone of anything. I do think that you are playing with fire when you associate with people like that. I mean, and it, again, doesn't have to just be anti-Semitism. It can be any sort of ism where people are saying racist things or homophobic things or anything like that. When you associate with people like that, when you take their coin, that affects you. That affects how people perceive you. And so I think that I'm glad he's come out and said he's against anti-Semitism. I think that refusing this person's money would be a little more demonstrative. We have seen politicians in the past return money from groups that didn't back them up, that they thought were too extreme, and they didn't want to be associated with it. There's tons of money in politics, so there's not a shortage of places to get money from, especially when you're running for governor of a major state. I remember this came up a few years ago with the Ron Paul campaign, that there were Stormfront people and other neo-Nazis sort of backing him up, and the response was, well, should we just give them, we're taking away their money, maybe that's good to not have the money. And I was like, no, you don't want to take these people's money. The thing about anti-Semites and bigots in general with politics is I've described them as the barnacles of the political world. They have a tendency to glom onto anyone that they see as an outsider. 10 years ago, it was Ron Paul. Even though Ron Paul wanted to end the war on drugs and let lots of people out of prison, which you think the Nazis would be against, because he was perceived as an outsider, and because they're always outsiders, they just glommed onto him. And then they sort of glommed onto Trump because he was an outsider. And now I think they might be glomming onto this campaign. I mean, it's just one guy, so we have to see what else is going on. But I am hesitant to read into a politician's views and philosophy and character the views of the more extremist supporters, but I do think a basic decency would require you to dissociate yourself from people like that.
Is it the money or the rhetoric that bothers you more? And I know in politics they kind of go together, But would some words and action be more meaningful here, or is giving the money back more meaningful, do you think?
I think that they're both important. I think you both have to say that this is unacceptable, and you have to say, I don't want to be associated with that person.
All right, somebody who does have a tremendous amount of power, Mastriano just wants it. He doesn't have it yet. Over in Russia, some really ugly stuff is going on. This is a little detailed. We'll link to it in the show notes. Folks can go in and read it for themselves. But basically, long story short, Vladimir Putin is threatening to shut down the Jewish agency in Russia. That is the agency that returned. Israel has a right of return. Anybody that has Jewish blood back to their grandparents has a right to citizenship in Israel. Something like 1 million people from Russia has gone to Israel. It's a huge part of Israel's original immigrant population. He's threatening to shut all this down now all of a sudden. There's geopolitical involved in this because Israel's been kind of a go-between during this Ukraine war crisis and a lot of other things. Russia's got a long history of this kind of stuff, and Vladimir Putin specifically has a bad history with certain groups. This is anti-Semitism on a global geopolitical level, yeah?
Yeah, but I also think it's more related to Putin's sort of desperation and dementia with what's going on in the world. That, he's got the West united against him. The war in the Ukraine has not gone as well as he wanted to, and especially at the hands of a Jewish president. I think that this is sort of him lashing out in frustration more than anything else. I think the only guide star that we are certain of with Vladimir Putin's philosophy is he favors Vladimir Putin. And he favors building Russia up to be more like the imperial Russia of the past, or that he imagines imperial Russia to have been in the past than it is now. And I think any and every group is just someone he's willing to step on to get there. And so Jews are an easy target, and it also tries to keep Israel in line and other countries in line. But I don't think it's necessarily indicative of a coming storm or anything like that. But you never know. I hesitate to look into someone with this disease of the mind as Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I don't blame you for that. Even if it's not directly related at the Jewish community, though, when he does something like with Ukraine, where he starts in with the anti-Nazi stuff, which has all those overtones that go with it, that's still got to just land wrong, though, with the Jewish community, right? I mean, I'm just normal people recoil at that. I imagine it's got to be specifically really perks up the ears of the Jewish community, like anti-Nazi. What are you doing?
Yeah, and that's again a lot more connected to internal politics of Russia, that you have with Russia this memory of the Great Patriotic War and the Nazis invading Russia and killing millions and millions of Russian people and so forth. So it's connected with that as much as it is anti-Semitism, that this long history and their pride in winning their part of World War II against the Nazis. But yeah, and especially given what's going on in Ukraine is basically an ethnic cleansing of Ukrainians, given the history of trying to ethnically cleanse Ukrainians, Jewish or not. Ukraine has always had a large Jewish population, but last year I read Ann Applebaum's fantastic book, Red Famine, about the Holodomor. And, I think that it's less connected with anti-Semitism than it is on Putin trying to weaponize the rhetoric of the past, trying to otherize the Ukrainians, trying to justify. And we have over 1 million Ukrainians deported to Russia. We have children being torn away from families. This is absolutely an ethnic cleansing. And you don't have to necessarily be killing Jews to be in that Nazi category. I think if you're ethnically cleansing a country, you're Nazi adjacent if you're not actually there.
Separating countries and politics from stuff like this is hard. It doesn't get any harder than when it comes to the nation of Israel. How do we parse that one out? Because the real bad faith actors that want to be anti-Semitic, who cannot stand the Jewish people for whatever twisted reason they have, they love to work in that gray space of like, oh, we're not anti-Jewish, we're anti-Zionist. And then they start parsing that out. I know it's tough to delve into that, but that's just the reality we are in. What do you do with that? Because like you're saying with Russia, Israel is also a country. Not everybody in Israel is a Jew. They have other minority groups as well. How do we handle that one without delving into those dark reaches where those people start grabbing people and twisting their minds and twisting their words with it?
It's tricky that you have an Israeli government that has done things that a lot of people disagree with the West Bank and so forth. That I think even people who support the existence of Israel and the nation of Israel have problems with. And so you have a large middle ground and so forth. But it is, what I like to say is that, if you're anti the state of Israel, you're talking about dismantling the state that is the homeland to basically half of the Jews in the world, and dismantling a state that has protected those people for, almost going on 75 years now. And so it's one thing to oppose Israel's expansion of the West Bank. It's one thing to oppose how they're acting in, say, the Gaza Strip or something like that. But to be against the existence or to have favor a one-state solution, I think is I don't know if it's necessarily anti-Semitic, but you're talking about a set of policies and a set of positions that many people would be considered dangerous to the continued survival of that state.
I guess it's kind of like with Ukraine, where I'm like, yes, Ukraine has issues and they're not a perfect country either, but they don't deserve to be wiped off the map either. I think we can say the same with Israel. Like, I can support Israel as a concept and as a friend and as an ally. I can condemn them when they do individual things wrong. You still don't get to wipe them out because of whatever problems they have as a country. That's way too far. And then we need to hash out the gray area. Is that the fair way to look at that?
Yeah, the problem with if you're talking about, if you disagree with what they're doing in the West Bank or Gaza, the problem is not the existence of the state of Israel. The problem is the people leading it right now, the people who are leading. Although they've just had a change in leadership, so that may change things. But yeah, I think that's a perfect way of putting it. That we can be allies with country, we can support a country, we can support the existence of country while still disagreeing with even very vociferously with some of the policies they're engaged in.
Yeah. Tough topic today. Really hard questions. You didn't duck any of them, even when I didn't ask them really particularly well. That's why, my friend, we need to get you one of the like wrestling belts, like most seen guest on the show, and you can have it over your shoulder every time you come out until somebody takes it from you. We'll look into doing that. It might have to be a screen graphic because we have no budget. Dr. Michael Siegel, you do wonderful work, sir. On the road and appearing anywhere, greatly appreciate that. Let folks know where they can follow you and what you have going on writing wise until they see you again.
I'm away this week, but ordinarily I appear at least once a week on Ordinary Times, ordinary-times.com. You can see how_RTFLC is where you can follow me on Twitter. You can also just go to YouTube and Google Mike's and check out Mike Siegel Astronomy, where I talk about astronomy and movies, including addressing your favorite movie of all time. So yeah, I'm not difficult to find.
Michael Siegel, appreciate you, my friend. Yeah, the YouTube channel that was an Armageddon dig. It's not my favorite movie of all time, but it's my favorite movie to throw at astronomers at all time because it just drives them crazy because of all the inaccuracies. But go watch the YouTube channel. It's fantastic stuff. You're a fantastic guest. You're an even better friend. Thank you for the time today, my friend.
Oh, always glad to be on. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Talk again soon.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.